It was an unauthorised set of transactions and it was without the knowledge of the board. The individual ended up serving time in prison. Boards can only ever know what management choose to share with them.
Today's guest is Danuta Gray. Danuta is currently Chair of Croda plc, a non-executive director and chair of the Remuneration Committee at Burberry Group plc.
There is therefore quite a lot of pressure on the chief exec and the CFO to be somewhat schizophrenic, knowing what's happening behind the scenes and yet at the same time coming out of the room, shaking themselves down and carrying on as if nothing was happening. You know, it's as lonely being a chair sometimes as it is a CEO.
Welcome to Enter the Boardroom. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newrol, home of the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board members. Danuta, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Thank you, Ollie.
Can I start by asking you about your formative board experiences? And I'm curious to hear, what's been the single experience that has most shaped how you operate as a chair and board member today?
So you won't be surprised to say it wasn't a single experience, Ollie. I'm sure you've heard that before. It's a sort of a collection of experiences and scars over the years. But I do reflect on the first two non-exec roles I had were back when I was in Ireland, and it was quite an interesting period. So one was on the board of Aer Lingus and one was on the board of a life and pensions business, Irish Life and Permanent, which had a bank on the side. And on the board of Aer Lingus, I joined just after it had partially IPO'd, literally just afterwards. And I was sitting on that board, and within 6 weeks of joining the board and them partially IPOing, we faced several hostile takeover attempts by Ryanair. And so I'll come back to the lessons, but that was quite formative in terms of seeing, you know, at first hand advisors operate with a board, how a board dynamic works in that situation, and very stressful because it was all in the public domain, it was all in the media. And then the second was on the board of this life and pensions business that had a retail bank on the side. And that was during the turmoil of the global financial crisis, which, you know, you recall Ireland had a particularly difficult time. On that board, as well as dealing with that as a backdrop, we did face a situation where the executives had undertaken an agreement with another bank that flattered the latter's numbers. It was an unauthorised set of transactions and it was without the knowledge of the board. And that, when discovered, resulted in execs having to leave the business very quickly, including the CEO. But it also ended up in a criminal case, in which case the individual ended up serving time in prison. Now, that was a really dramatic situation. But I suppose in both, what I watched was the then chairs of those businesses step in and step up to calmly help navigate a board through difficult situations. So you kind of understood that the role of the chair and how their demeanour helped navigate through a critical environment. That you also learned that, particularly in the latter case, boards can only ever know what management choose to share with them. So there's lots of ways you can test and get transparency, but ultimately, even with risk and audit committees in financial services and even with external oversight, things can happen and you have to be prepared for that. And I think the other thing, even though it's very pragmatic, is in a crisis, the board has to step in, and the level of time commitment you need to assume that you would have to give to an organisation increases significantly. So if you think about those two as a fairly new, fairly green non-exec, observing that at first hand, you start to understand and observe board dynamics, the chair's role, what a crisis feels like and looks like. And I've always felt that a board role is a bit like an apprenticeship. You learn these things over time. And so that helps form you as a board director for future situations, but also then as you move on to a chair role is sort of learning from some of those types of situations that you can take with you into future problems.
It reminds me, I think there's nothing quite like a restructuring to sharpen a NED's understanding of their responsibilities and liabilities. It goes from feeling, well, this is quite an easy job to, oh my gosh.
Yes. Oh my gosh is exactly the right phrase. You get the phone call and you go, Deep breath. Oh my gosh. But that was they were very formative, those experiences. Lots of things since then have helped, but those were very early on. And I think that helped me assess, how you operate as a non-exec.
So can you bring to life that step in and step up that the chairs did in those situations for someone listening?
I'd say probably more in the latter case where there was a real crisis of what is this transaction that the execs had undertaken? How come the board didn't know? And the chair at the time, who sadly passed on too young, was a lady called Gillian Bowler, who had run her own business. She was extremely knowledgeable. She was entrepreneurial, but very thorough in her approach to chairmanship. And that step in her situation involved calling a board meeting late in an evening, calling the advisors around the table, stepping in at quite short notice into the role of the chief exec for a short period of time until deciding on an interim chief exec, navigating quite a number of stakeholders. And in that situation, if you think about in the global financial crisis, that involved government as well. So, really having to pull around her as well, the board. And so she was very good at working out which experts she needed externally, which experts around the board table she needed close to her in a sort of, if you like, the core action team, and how other board members would play their role. So she was very thoughtful, very calm, very logical, very thorough. But, she didn't have a playbook to go to, but she knew who to go to help her with the playbook. And she just took control of a very difficult situation and helped us navigate through it. I can remember the board being called. It was 6:00 in the evening and it was a half term and I was supposed to be going on holiday with my family skiing. And I was literally on the way to the airport and I got the call to say, I really need you back here. And I'm like, well, I'm going on holiday. Can I do? I really need you back here now. Okay. What on earth has happened? And then go into the boardroom at 6:00. I think it was a Thursday evening. And we were there very, very late.
So that step in and step up sounds like significant investments of time as well as really rolling up sleeves. Do you think that experience has shaped how you think about your capacity as a non-exec?
Yeah, I'm a bit left brain in that. So whenever you take on a role, people will give you it'll be a day a month or 2 days a week, whatever it is. I always double it. And the other thing I do is I sort of have a very logical view of the world, which is how many days a week would I want to work? How many weeks a year? When do I want holidays? So I sort of have this little framework. And then I always leave capacity to make sure that if there is a problem, I can help and step in. So I don't want to get to the point where you're so stretched that you can't deal with situations that are unforeseen.
Tell me more about the experience with the executives, because that must have felt very galling to have people, I guess, that you sort of trust and rely on. How has that shaped how you now work with execs and do those audits and tests of what's happening in the business?
Look, I don't think it undermined the trust that you have with the executive teams that you operate with. And to be fair to the individuals, there was a context in the crisis and things that were happening that created an amount of pressure that I suspect led them to do something that they probably didn't see was as challenging as it turned out to be. I think what it does is makes you, first of all, appreciate that pressure that people are under, number one. I think number two is, always remember to ask the more difficult questions or the quizzical mindset, listen to dissonant voices in the boardroom so that you are always reflective on the risk of groupthink in some capacity or another. I worked with another chair who said, always listen to that dissonant voice. There's something that someone has spotted that is easy to pass over. But it's very important that you hear that and truly listen to that at any point in time. The other thing is that, you don't get to know a business and a team in the boardroom. That's an environment in which you operate together. What's essential is that you're out in a business and you see how it operates, that you've got a broader set of relationships than just the two executive directors. And what's important for me in joining any organisation is there a transparency? Is there a willingness to allow a board to see into a business by the chief exec? Because I think that's a very healthy attitude to have. And it gives you reassurance on cultures, behaviours, how things actually operate. You know, if you're in a business like Croda, which I chair, we have multiple sites all around the world. By visiting them, you get a sense of consistency in culture, differences in culture, you know, clarity around strategy, understanding how people are interacting with customers and each other. You need to have that breadth and depth of experience of a team so that you are getting reinforcement that what you're hearing in the boardroom is consistent with what you're seeing in the organisation in a wider sense.
You remind me of Neil Johnson, who's the chair of Kinetic, who talked in episode 162 about how he used to go out as a patrolman when he was CEO of the RAC. And when he first showed up at 2 a.m. in wherever it was and having a sort of bacon sandwich, they all sort of looked a bit curious. But over time, he built trust and actually got some really good insights into what was happening in the business. Curious to hear, what do you do now, if it's not dressing up as a patrolman at the RAC, to go get that exposure as a chair?
Well, I mean, I think they would be horrified if I turned up in one of our manufacturing sites and thought that I was going to be of any use whatsoever. But it's about, as I said, it's about getting out. So for example, in the last year, I visited our team in Korea, where the business was bought 2-3 years ago. It's a relatively new business. You sit down with the scientists. We have sort of sessions with younger talent where people are asked to be very free and open with their views. They always are. They're absolutely excellent in Croda in doing that. You actually go around the manufacturing sites, and what's great there is you're always looking to see, you know, we have a great deal of emphasis, as you might understand, on health and safety. And how does that actually happen in reality on site? How do people see that? So you do it by walking about, you do it by team sessions, you do it by meeting young talent. In Burberry, we have a workforce, a global forum for our employees, for our teams. And the board sit in and have discussions on different topics on that. And they're always very open, very transparent. And you get to learn a lot about how an organisation operates, but also feels about itself. And that's how I do it. But no, I wouldn't be pretending to be a brilliant salesperson in a Burberry store or somebody operating in a manufacturing environment in Croda to do that. It's much more about meeting people and having those conversations with them in an unforced way, so in a more relaxed setting.
Can we talk about that Aer Lingus experience you mentioned, that takeover experience? And because you've chaired through several major takeover or bid experiences and multiple CEO transitions as well, which are arguably the two most consequential and difficult judgments a chair ever makes. I'd love to explore how you think about those moments. And maybe we could take as an example the moment when you first received Aviva's approach as chair of Direct Line. Before any analysis had been done, what was your instinctive reaction?
So first of all, any board that's doing its job properly will always have a playbook. You know, you have a process in mind. If someone calls or if an approach is made through an invite, whichever way, you know how to handle that particular process. So you would never jump in, you would never make a judgment call just as the chair, and you would never immediately respond to a call or an approach in the first instance, number one. The second thing you have to do is to make sure that you understand your own business and the value that your own business has. So the first thing I would say is you don't kind of jump in and react to that immediate call. If it's a formal approach, there's a process you go through. If it's a bit of a request for a meeting, there's another process. And you know that, and you have your team supporting you, your general counsel, and you always have your advisory panel set up, which we might talk about. So that call or that approach comes in, and you press the start button on, do we have a formal process here or not? And if we do, then these are the next steps that we need to take. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that all boards should have a clear view of the business plan they've signed off with their executive team, what the value is of the business today and what value can be created by executing on that plan. So you can take a judgment ultimately when you start to get to that decision-making time as to what's the hurdle that you have to get over in order to engage in that conversation seriously or not. Is that offer serious? Is that offer one that is executable? Does that actually value the business sufficiently that it is worth engaging in a conversation? So those are the kinds of dynamics that you think about when you get a call of some description.
Does the emotional atmosphere in the boardroom when a takeover offer lands change in your experience?
To change, look, it's certainly not a business as usual board conversation. That the emotions can be different, but I would say that having been in the seat as chair in 3 transactions that concluded, and I've also seen a merger, and we talked about Aer Lingus, which was rejected, and I've actually been in the seat as an executive on the receiving end as well. So I won't go into specifics on each one, but I think in terms of emotion, you don't always have the benefit of being together when an offer lands. So there isn't a boardroom setting in which that is observed. But I think more often than not, I've always felt my heart sinking a little because of a couple of things. First of all, these situations can be an enormous distraction. So you have, regardless of whether they succeed, get to the end of a process, become public, stay private, whatever it is, it's a distraction. And that means if you have a team and you have a plan that the board fully support and they're committed to executing on that, then the one thing you know is there are going to be some people in the executive who know about this and quite a large number, the vast majority who do not. And it becomes really, really quite difficult to help them navigate through that. So the chair has a big role to give air cover to the team, but it's bound to affect, isn't it, a chief exec and a couple of their people. So that's one thing. And I think the board also have a bit of a sense of maybe the chance to prove that this team can deliver on that plan may be taken away from them in some way, shape or form. I don't mean by losing their jobs, but just not independently, not separately as a team. So there's a little bit of okay. And then you get into the process and it either gets to the end or it doesn't. But at the end, you have to park the emotion and you have to just take that view of what's in the best interests of the company overall and what is in our shareholders' best interest, because that's in a listed environment, that's what we're representing. So that's how it feels, I think, or that's how I feel it. And I think a lot of my board directors will probably say the same. So
you talked about the distraction of one of these bids. And I've seen that as an investor many times where the executive end up so focused on the transaction, they forget about the business and it starts trading down. And I'm curious to hear whether your experience of going through so many of these has taught you if there are ways that you can minimize that impact on the business or whether it's just unavoidable.
Well, I don't think it is unavoidable that trading deteriorates. I don't accept that. I think it's extremely hard. It's typically from an executive team perspective. It would typically be your chief exec, the chief financial officer, the general counsel, who would be in the know sort of all the way through, the company secretary as well. But you do try to minimize, in the early stages at least, who knows about that. So there is therefore quite a lot of pressure on the chief exec and the CFO to be somewhat schizophrenic knowing what's happening behind the scenes, and yet at the same time coming out of the room, shaking themselves down and carrying on as if nothing was happening. So I'm very conscious of that. And, the role of the board and as chair is to help provide air cover and take as much of that pressure off them as possible, because it's ultimately a board decision. That's the other thing I'm very conscious of. Sometimes it's a situation where the chief exec isn't as in control as they are for many, many other situations. So in the early days, you can manage through that. The challenge comes when it becomes a serious offer that you believe is a chance of succeeding, and you have to enter into, whether it's due diligence or more detailed conversations that require others to be in the loop, or you've agreed the deal, but you haven't closed it fully because you've either got regulatory hurdles or shareholder approvals to go through. So there's a dynamic where everybody knows it's happening, but it hasn't yet closed. And that's when, support for your executive team is critical to help them navigate that situation. And in some cases, when their own future is uncertain. And then that's when you see the real quality of the people that you work with. So I haven't seen trading drift in the situations where I've been the chair. And I think that's because of the quality of the leadership team that we had, who want to prove that they were executing on their plan regardless. So credit to them for that. But I know how pressured that environment was for them.
Every week, I sit down with chairs in mastermind groups. Invariably, they say the same thing. They wish they'd discovered these groups sooner. If you've made it into the boardroom, you're almost certainly already a high performer with a growth mindset. But where can board members like you go for practical professional development? There's no obvious place to learn, develop, or share challenges with peers who genuinely understand them. That's exactly why we created the Enter the Boardroom community. If you want to keep improving as a board member, head to etb.newroll.com and take a look at our Fellows membership, designed for experienced board members like you. One of the other things I've seen often go wrong in those scenarios is that an executive team get excited about the transaction going through, it then falls over, and the team have already started projecting things in their personal lives. Maybe they think it's going to allow them to buy a new house or something, and then it can be really hard for them to pick themselves up again. Are there other gotchas like that you have learned from those experiences that a board member who hasn't been through that should be on the lookout for?
That is a gotcha. It is a difficult environment to navigate through. It's not one I've had as much experience of, but I have had some. I think the trick is that you, particularly when you're in the chair role, that you stay very close to your board and your executive team throughout, not just as a unitary body, but with the individuals concerned. Because people deal with the stress of that situation in different ways, and sometimes it can surprise you. So if someone's never been through the situation, they may just not know what to expect. So making sure that you spend time talking through what's likely to happen, talking through the possible outcomes, making sure the advisors take time to explain the responsibilities that we all have, but also sit down and address with anyone any particular worries that they have. Some people get concerned about being pressured by shareholders to conclude a deal. So particularly if something as an approach hits the press, you get all of the incoming calls from shareholders. And it's not, you get a view of what they all think, but it sometimes isn't very helpful because you'll get a whole range from take the deal now to don't sell. It's sort of like, that's not very helpful, chaps, but we'll thank you for your input. And it can get quite aggressive. There'll be some shareholders who can say to you, you better not lose this deal. And you go, okay. And then on the second part of the sentence, but you better not sell for less than X. And you go, guys, we absolutely understand, get the shareholder value. You have to manage those situations. And I'm okay with that. I'm happy to navigate those conversations. But some people on the board who maybe haven't been through that may get a bit blindsided by some of that type of incoming conversation, but also commentary in the press, because you'll get the media who think they know all the answers to a situation, and that also feels quite uncomfortable at times. So making sure you are staying close to each individual, the understanding what they're worried about, making sure they've got the support they need, so that when you come together as a board and you have to make decisions at certain points, they're all fully informed. They feel they've been well advised. They feel that we are staying together as a unit. And you may not all agree on the exact nature of the outcome, but you're more or less as a cabinet in the right direction, the right space. So that's when a chair's role, I think, is incredibly important, is to keep that calm focus and just keep reassuring people, the true north is in the best interest of the company overall. We've got a sense of the value of this business, the risk it will take to execute on our plan. We've heard from shareholders, we'll hear from advisors, but we in the end are going to make this decision, stand or fall. And that will help guide you through. I mean, in the Direct Line situation, I'm sure you're aware, but we did have another approach before Aviva the year before. And that was not an offer that was anywhere near the value that we knew our business had and had to create. And there was some peculiarities about shareholder structures that meant there were some question marks as to whether this was going to be executable or not. And that did get leaked to the press. And so again, you had that pressure. But what was great was we were all very clear that that was not the right offer. We were robust in defending against that. And our advisors were as robust as we were. And so even though some people, found that challenging, it was really good as a sort of practice playbook for the board to know how to work together through that type of situation.
Do you always bring the whole board into the detail, or do you sometimes bring a smaller group in first?
So I would typically have a smaller group that would help make sure that we've got a playbook ready, that we've done all the work we need to do just in case. And that smaller group will also work on a number of the detailed steps behind the scenes, because it's quite difficult to garner a full board on everything. But what I insist on is that we keep the full board informed, and we also have regular check-ins with the full board. And any decision point is for the board itself to come together. So it is good to have a smaller group that everyone on the board trusts and that everyone knows about, and everyone is comfortable that to keep momentum in a certain situation, they're comfortable to have that team with delegated authority to execute up to a point. But they also need to trust and know that they will be A, kept informed, and B, brought into the wider conversation at critical points in any of those processes.
You talked about that experience of when you're trying to work out whether to recommend an offer. What for you are the key questions a board needs to offer that might not be obvious to someone listening who hasn't been through that process?
So one of the most important things, Ollie, in this situation is to have the right group of advisors around you, and preferably advisors that you know and trust and have relationships with before a situation arises. And that is the bankers, the brokers, the lawyers, the PR company. And it is important, I think, as much as you can, is for the whole board to have knowledge of who those are. Brokers would more likely be known by everyone because of the nature of how they interact with a board. Lawyers less so sometimes, and maybe financial advisors who are more transaction oriented, maybe less so. So first of all, make sure you've got the right advisors, because they will help guide you through the kinds of questions that you need to ask. But it does stand or fall on an understanding of the value of the business, as I said before, and the value that could be created through the execution of the plan. But there are other questions you have to be assured of in order to fully be able to accept an offer. So, for example, one of the questions is this executable? So is it clear that the offerer doesn't have, for example, a very complex shareholder structure that could be a huge barrier? Is it clear that they can actually raise the funds, whether that's through cash or equity, whatever, that can conclude this? I mean, I know these sound simple, but they're extremely important. And I think we also reflect on, is this the right parent for the business, for the future of this business? But ultimately, in the UK environment, if the offer is significant enough, you have a duty to inform your shareholders of that, because they ultimately will determine whether you fully accept an offer or not. Unfortunately, what I would say is very often that can be taken from your hands because the information about an approach gets into the media. And then you've got a different cycle of a bit of a frenzy around the situation, that you just have to stay calm. You have to stay true to the decision-making process that you've got in place. And you have to navigate through that regardless of the commentary that you read about in the Mail or the Times or any other paper.
Why does that get so difficult? Is it simply just reading about it and therefore you're better off not reading?
It's the pressure. It's the pressure that comes in on you. It's much better if you can conclude these things in private, because there's always a dynamic, I mean, it's rare, I think, that any organization accepts the initial approach. There's a discussion. There are elements that you want to probe on. The offeror will want to check on a number of points of detail should you get into the zone where you could accept an offer. There's the dynamic that happens behind the scenes that is always preferable, I think, that you can have that kind of dialogue without it being played out in public. When it gets into the public domain, then media commentary, it's not fun. I'll be honest with you. I hate being in the media. It's not ever a desire. And the media have their own opinions on, who's buying whom and what the dynamics of any particular approach should or should not look like. And they will talk to the shareholders, and you will get shareholder views directly and through the media. And so you get this sort of wave of pressure coming through. And what you must do is resist that to come to a decision before you're ready to make your decision. But not everyone around a board table will have experienced that. And that's my point earlier. I said about staying close to your board, staying close to the directors individually, staying close as a group to make sure that if anyone's feeling particularly uncomfortable with that you bring in even, the PR company to talk about how to navigate, how to communicate effectively, how to manage that conversation with the media as much as the shareholders, just to help guide you through what can be quite a turbulent time.
Can you describe the actual moment and process by which the Direct Line board moved from rejecting that initial approach to recommending the improved offer?
Well, I'm not going to go into the specifics of any particular conversations, but when an offer comes in, you will look at the shape of the offer and the amount of the offer and where it lands on a valuation set of measures that the advisors will have guided you through based on your plan. And when you get into a particular range, you know that you are within a range of what would be acceptable from the board point of view. If by that stage it's become public, then you will also have a sense from your shareholders, even though you'll get one that says sell now and another says never sell, to take two extremes. But you'll start to get a sort of sense of where people might coalesce as to be perceived to be the sensible outcome. And when you get within that range, then the dialogue is around, can you close in on a particular dynamic? And that's when the negotiation concludes or doesn't. So in the case of the Aviva Direct Line situation, it did conclude satisfactorily for both parties, whereas in the previous attempt that had come in from Ageas, it didn't. And so you get a real good sense of where you are going to conclude or not and how you get to that end point. And when you get to that end point, then you basically sit together as a board. You just do the checklist of, have you covered off all of the perspectives that you should? Is this the right outcome for the business? Is this the right outcome for the shareholders? And then you make the decision. And it's generally reasonably clear at that point.
Have you ever had a situation where there was a disconnect between the valuation and what the shareholders wanted?
No, they tend to be broadly in line with where you end up. There was one situation where we had St Modwin, it was bought by Blackstone. The board and its advisors at that time came to a conclusion at a particular price, but one of the shareholders, a major shareholder, didn't agree that it was sufficient. To be fair to that shareholder, I'd had a direct conversation with them and they'd told me they didn't believe it was sufficient and they were going to say so publicly. And in some ways that was interesting because that gave us an opportunity to go back and get an improved offer. So that wasn't a surprise. It was a direct conversation that then led to a commentary externally, and that allowed us to negotiate up.
That's interesting. What have been your lessons about that situation, managing a large shareholder who disagrees with the board's recommendation? One struck me there listening to you is actually that's quite a nice negotiating technique you could use as a chair to get
I wouldn't recommend that as a negotiating technique because you don't actually want to necessarily have that played out with a major shareholder going, I don't agree. And to be fair, he wasn't being unreasonable. He had a perspective on what he saw as the opportunity set in a particular part of the business. And neither of us were wrong, but it helped us renegotiate. I think the best lesson I've ever been given is by a very experienced chair before I became a chair. And he said, look, once you get the job, the first thing you should do is insist on meeting all your major shareholders. And even though they may not want to see you because there's no reason, they much prefer to talk to the execs on a regular basis, try and force your way in so you get to know them. You get to know them in a steady state. You get to know them early on. You get to hear from each of them, the thesis that they've bought into, what their objectives are, and them as individuals. So that if you have a situation, whether it's an approach or whether it's a bump in the road or whether there's a whatever, you know who those individuals are and you know the names and the faces that you can put together so you can have an open dialogue with your shareholders at different times of the relationship. And so I've followed that advice and it's been extremely helpful.
And at what point as a chair, if at all, do you have that frank conversation with your CEO about their future under a potential acquirer? And how do you time that conversation so it doesn't distort their advice or compromise the process?
So I believe in open and direct and honest conversations, whether it's with board directors or with your chief exec. And the conversation is right at the beginning that there's been an approach. This may or may not conclude. And you need to remember that this is a board decision and ultimately we have to make this as a board in the best interest of the company and the shareholders. So I'm sure, you've got a lot of emotions about this, whether it's disappointment, excitement, whatever it is. I need you to stay focused on the business. I'll keep you posted and you'll be involved in a number of the conversations. But there's no guarantee of an outcome either way on this. So I don't want you to run ahead of the decision. And by the way, whatever happens, you'll always be treated with respect and properly and professionally, regardless of whatever the outcome is. Doesn't take away the emotion, but at least they know that, first of all, it's a board decision. It's not the chief exec's decision. This is not like a founder situation where they may have huge significant sharing in the business. And that it could go either way, that they have to focus on the business. We won't hide from them what's happening because they're part of the board, the unitary board. And then at some point, either they will or won't stay with the business and you can have that conversation with them as well. And you can just professionally navigate through that. So as long as you treat people properly, I've not had a problem with that type of conversation.
So if you're advising a chair now who's just received an unsolicited approach and has never been through a takeover process before, what are the 3 things you'd tell them that nobody else will?
Well, I'm sure lots of people give them lots of advice, Ollie. I'm sure there's nothing in this that they won't have heard. Oh, look, the most obvious things for make sure you've got the right advisory team around you and don't wait to get an approach to do it. So if you're a new chair, make sure you're comfortable with that. And personally, as the chair, not just the advisors as in a group, but who are the one or two that you can make the phone call to on a Sunday evening when you are worried about how to navigate the next steps? You know, it's as lonely being a chair sometimes as it is a CEO. So who are the ones that you've really got that kind of relationship with from the group of advisors that you have around you? And if you haven't got people like that, then you need to forge relationships that can help you, and do that right at the start of your chair career. You will know a number of these individuals just because if you've been around the boardrooms, you will have seen them. But having those, I can pick up the phone to X on a Sunday evening and reassure me that I'm actually handling this correctly or not. So I would say that. I think also make sure that your COSEC and GC are your partners through this. So, you know, when you become the chair, testing those relationships, making sure they're fully trusted. So that's really important. I think if it goes public, hold your nerve. You are going to get a wide range of views, whether it's from the media or the shareholder. You and your board are the ones who really need to have a sense of what's going to work. And don't be taken off guard by that. You just you know what's right for the business. You've got the right people advising you. Make sure you hold that true. And as in life, I would say you can be surprised at how people can react in a stressful or intense situation. So knowing your board, knowing the directors, know how they're feeling is extremely important. And having a sense of which board directors are going to have either experienced this, are calmer, so that in your subgroup, you can rely on them to be with you through that process. And sometimes having them speak first in the board as well can be very reassuring for the other directors. So just understanding the dynamic and the emotions that are flying around the boardroom as you face into this is extremely important. So you don't face into someone who's unrealistic about what kind of deal could be struck, someone who worries about being criticised in the press as a board, so you can actually help keep people close to you rather than them feeling isolated and under pressure.
If you want a space to connect, test your thinking, and learn with board peers, the Enter the Boardroom community is built exactly for that. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout. That's all we have time for with Danuta in this episode. We covered a lot: the criminal case and hostile takeover that shaped how Danuta thinks about crisis leadership, how boards should prepare for and navigate a bid, and the hidden pressures that land on a chair when a deal goes public. In part 2, we pick the conversation up as Danuta turns to the chair-CEO relationship, including how to hire the right CEO, knowing when it's time for them to go, and what a NED should do when they disagree with their chair. So do join us next time for part 2 of my conversation with Danuta.